Laney's joining us. How's it going, Laney?
Good.
We're glad you're here. All right. Welcome to class, everybody. We're going to cover war and terrorism in ethics philosophy 304 tonight. We do have, I am recording this because we have several people that are gone, and I'm going to post it to YouTube. So just to cover what the future holds for this class. This is the last official class period of Philosophy 304. We will have covered all of the stuff. Hopefully your final papers are in. I did get everybody's response papers graded. So the only things that aren't graded at this point would be your essays that if you just submitted your essay the last 2 weeks, those would be things that I need to grade. But, and I'll try to get those done in the next week, but it might be the second week because next Monday is considered Easter break. So we don't have class next Monday. The following Monday, I will send out a Zoom review link. So, and we will cover anything on Zoom at Zoom review over the final exam, anything that maybe I didn't cover in class, or I don't feel like, I prepared you for the final exam. And Mackenzie asked, have I sent out the final exam review sheet? I have not. So I will try to get that done. I got to make sure this class, I had to modify a bunch of things. So I need to make sure that the final exam doesn't have like topics in there that we didn't cover and, fun stuff like that. So it may be right before we actually have our Zoom review, but you'll have a full week from the Zoom review to the time that we actually take the final exam. You'll have a chance to take a look at that. Again, there's no essays. You're absolutely done with all writing portions of this class. You won't have any more essays or anything like that. So, so we'll meet tonight. In 2 weeks, we have a Zoom review. I'll probably make it optional. So if you don't want to come, that's up to you. I figure you're an adult. You can make that decision for yourself. I don't anticipate the Zoom review taking too long. I'm thinking maybe 20 minutes. So I would highly encourage everyone to attend the Zoom review, but you don't have to. So in 3 weeks, we'll meet here. I'll hand out a scan sheet. It'll have 50 multiple choice questions. When you're done with those multiple choice questions, you can leave. And later on that week, I will upload your grades, and that'll be it for the class. So any questions about anything?
I just wondered about, how we're going to do that at the review of the class.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Did you guys get an email that said?
No.
Does the school? I never email those out. Does the school email? The school does.
Yeah, my RA said the school does. He said it should come out like within the next week.
In the next week, Lainey said that she was told. Okay. All right. Well, what I'll probably do is email out to everybody, I'll probably try to email out to everybody and just tell you, hey, when you submit your review of the class, your evaluation, then email me and let me know. And when we have all 13 of them done, I'll give everybody a 5% grade bump. Does that sound like a plan? Okay. Sorry it's taken so long. Usually it's already there by this point in the semester, and I actually don't do this very often. I've only done it 2 other times, and I think there was like a few years in between the last times I did it, but I don't know. As an adjunct professor, I think it's important to get feedback. So anyway, so that's why I just decided to go ahead and do it. Plus, I figured during a pandemic, nobody minds an extra 5% just for filling out a evaluation of the class. So Okay, all right, very good. I keep waiting for more people to show up on Zoom, but I'm not seeing them, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started. All right, any other questions about anything to do with the class? All right, we are thrilled that Allie's back. Allie, were you at the first class or no?
What?
Is this your first class that you've actually been here?
Oh, no, I've been here
You were at least at the first one, right?
first and second.
Okay. All right. Well, we are thrilled that you're here.
Thank you. Hold on one second.
All right. Well, tonight we're going to take a look at war and terrorism. And if you have your book online or like a physical one, I would encourage you to get it out. There's actually some really, really helpful things, not that the other chapters don't, but when it comes to war and terrorism, I think that this chapter provides a lot of thought-provoking things. So if you have it, go ahead and pull it out. I've got it on page 370, chapter 9. All right, so when it comes to war and terrorism, what are some of the ethical issues that come to mind for you?
Nuclear weapons.
Jalen?
It's so far.
Oh. Okay, so Allie says, oh, that's all right. We're gonna write them both down. Nuclear weapons. And what did you say, Jalen? Jalen, what talk to me, talk to the class about what it is about domestic terrorism that raises an ethical issue. Well, first off, can you explain what domestic terrorism is?
Domestic terrorism is where it is within the country, like the country acts on people for like, internal warfare, like assassinations, extremist groups, like one of the biggest.
But it's where people that don't dress up like military people and look like average citizens, right? And they're the ones that provide military attacks on local people, right? Non-combatants. So terrorism really targets non-combatants, right? That's sort of what they do. Okay. So what would be the ethical issues that you think are most pertinent to domestic terrorism? Okay. How what angle you want to take a look at it and then get back to us? Okay. All right. Allie, nuclear weapons. What are the ethical issues that surround nuclear weapons?
I mean, something I read, but I actually put in my essay was that having nuclear weapons isn't ethical and actually a harm to human life. And I mean, from my standpoint, I think we should have nuclear weapons and use them if necessary. But we don't need to just be like, you get a nuclear weapon on you, you get a nuclear weapon on you. No.
You don't want to Oprah the
No.
nuclear weapons?
Let's not do that, in my opinion, but I mean, have them in case there were a terrorist attack to come along or war, but I mean, have them, but don't use them unless necessary.
Would you, to go along with nuclear weapons, would you be willing, or would you include weapons of mass destructions, a little bigger umbrella, like chemical warfare?
Yeah, biological weapons, yeah.
Okay, all right, stuff like that. Okay. Yeah, harm to human life. And what ethical framework would you argue if you believe your stance is that we should have them, but only use them as a last resort? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, for me, what I use is utilitarianism because your consequences decide your actions. So if someone decides to do a terrorist attack, they could end up in jail unless they're big thing. Like, hi, you're gonna make your life go that way if you're gonna do a terrorist attack. Or I mean, I don't know much about war, but I really focus on terrorism. So it's something like affected my feelings. So.
And you would use utilitarianism to argue that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Webb.
I think another problem with weapons of mass destruction is
This WMD, weapons of mass destruction, and you say it doesn't act as a deterrent?
yeah, like you have nuclear weapons with no intent to have them influx your power.
Okay. What ethical framework might
I
work with that?
I use categorical imperative for my whole essay because goodwill. That's no, there's actually no intent of goodwill if you have nuclear bombs. Right.
So are you saying that we should have them or we
I
should
don't
not
think-
have?
I mean, I argue that we should not have. weapons of
Okay.
mass destruction.
Okay. Okay. I think you can absolutely use categorical imperative to make an argument that we shouldn't. And there's also I consider it a really good one. That's my bias. There's a really good essay in the back of the chapter. Did you use Jonathan Granoff?
Yeah, I did.
Can you kind of explain to the class what he argues?
I might have used it differently than you have, honestly. I don't know.
Oh, that's fine.
My way. And,
Yeah, you don't have to use it my way.
Because it was kind of hard for me to find an essay that like argued against, not having wars. Like most of the essays were for not having wars. So I just found like a couple of things he said in the essay that went against my ideology and thoughts. But let me see. So one thing he said, his main argument is that he thinks laws should be based off of human values. So basically, he says, I picked up a few lines he said that could be pretty much free for interpretation. You can use them either way. I just use them as an opposition because I need that one when I say it.
Okay.
The first line that I used as a negative was that he said that the recognition of the intrinsic sacredness of life and the duty of states and individuals to protect life is a fundamental characteristic of. Oh no, you said not sure. I'm sorry.
Yeah, because it sounds like you fits perfectly with what you're
Yeah, I
saying.
definitely did use something I said. Yeah. Is a fundamental characteristic of all human civilized values. This went with my family, obviously, because I think life is sacred and that we shouldn't, it's right, there shouldn't be a fringe upon. That could be more of like a natural law theory type of thing, I guess. I don't know, I guess I might speak out now, honestly. Another quote I used in my essay from Granoff was that deterrence proponents claim that nuclear weapons are not so much instruments for the waging of war, but political instruments intended to prevent war by depriving it of any possible rationale. So that's kind of like what I was talking about with deterrence, like we just have to
Yeah.
use to flex our power, we're not really going to use them. And if we do use them, obviously there's nothing good that comes from it. We saw that in Nagasaki, years after the bomb dropped. Not anymore. There's not actually any radioactive activity anymore, but there was still radioactive activity there. People's lives were affected. Millions of people, not millions, hundreds of thousands of people died. I think it was 600,000 over there. And another thing I talked about in my essay, talking about weapons of mass destruction, would be the Korean War, actually, because I took a class here on Cold War and terrorism. I'm a political science major. And in Korea, the United States dropped 100,000 more tons of bombs than they did in Japan. Like, it was just like, I did a PowerPoint on it, and it was like the deadliest war in the history because of all the bombs they used. So,
Which one?
Korean War.
The Korean War
Yeah, I
was?
mean, besides like, World War II.
Sure.
for the scale of the war, there was like an insane amount of deaths. I could probably go back to my slides and tell you. Yeah.
Well, he used to have two essays for the back of the book, Jonathan Granoff. And I think the one that they took out for the 7th edition, it had one of my favorite quotes, because I don't remember too many quotes from them. But and one might say that it's naive, but I like it. Anyway, I think there's truth in it, even if it's going to be hard to actually employ. But it says that we need a new paradigm when it comes to war and terrorism, where we replace the love of power with the power of love. And I know that sounds a little bit like a Hallmark TV show or something, but the reality is that if you believe that weapons of mass destruction are a threat to humanity and human existence, and you're aware of, just like Webb talked about, that when they were used, they did a significant amount of human life damage, and not just to the people that died that day, but for many years it created problems. I do think that what he argues in his essays, even if it's difficult to achieve, I think it's worth at least trying. I think it's like, well, what steps can we take to doing that? But a lot of people would think that eliminating weapons of mass destruction would, even if you're against weapons of mass destruction, a lot of people don't think necessarily that we should eliminate them. I don't know if I would argue that we should eliminate them or not. I do think that we should. I do think that we should work towards replacing the love of power with the power of love. But that I don't know how well that'll work. Except for Jesus showed us what that was like, and he got crucified. So anyway, that's my 2 cents about that. But what do you all think? Are weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons and stuff, should we actually work to eliminate them, or should we keep them and use them as a potential deterrent? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think we can eliminate them all away because we won't have anything to protect ourselves. But other countries are going to, so if we do, that will show us. I wrote that my essay about if you should have war or not, and if we stop that or stop eliminated all our weapons, we would be seen as
It'd be vulnerable, wouldn't it?
vulnerable.
Yeah, very vulnerable.
So I mean, I think you should use them when you need them, but I think it'd be a very bad thing to eliminate them all.
A bad thing to limit. Can you think of an ethical framework that you could use to make that argument?
I use utilitarianism in that case. So,
Utilitarianism?
yeah.
Okay. How about anybody else? Webb?
I agree that, I don't agree, and I do agree, because I have to recognize my own work.
It's complex, isn't it?
And I do think I think the reason everybody has nuclear bombs is, I read this actually in the book, I think, or something like that, is because we were the first country to have nuclear bombs. And so every other country followed our suit, because obviously we have that powerful weapon that can destroy and just make countries try not to use that word, messed up for years. They need to have them. But I think that the United States has a very, very powerful world influence. Maybe not as powerful as it used to be, because we're in a very terrible position now in 2020, 2021. There's a lot of division, but I still think we have a pretty good influence in the world, because we're not the most powerful country in the world. I'm not stupid or anything, I know we're not. But we've had that influence for so long. And if we do something like that, it's to say that the other countries might not back up and maybe they're right, because we've been the country that's been bombing everybody and blowing everybody up and using those weapons. Nobody else has really used them. So if we get rid of them and we're the only ones using them, maybe they'll get rid of them. I don't know. That's my thought.
I think that's a valid line of thinking. It uses logic, it uses reason. How about the rest of you? What do you think? What do you think about weapons of mass destruction? Are they things that we should work towards eliminating or not? Anthony?
I think we should keep around weapons of mass destruction. I believe that they're like, if the United States were to eliminate all of the nuclear bombs, there's no way to hold any, well, I don't want to say any other nation, but there's no way to hold every other nation accountable to eliminate their nuclear bombs as well. And I just don't think, in a realistic sense, there's any way to hold every nation accountable to completely eliminate weapons of mass destruction. And I believe that many wars have been stopped because of weapons of mass destruction. And I'm thinking like the Cold War, like we were so close, like nuclear, like pretty much fallout, you know.
Right.
And it pretty much just keeps everybody in check. It's a great way of check and balance. Like if you nuke me or my allies, I'm going to do your allies. And it's just, I think it's a safe but unsafe way of keeping the world at peace. On a larger scale. I don't mean I mean United States Russia war. I'm not talking like you know what I mean? Against like major nation conflict.
You're not talking about like Bosnia or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I'm not talking about like the Serbian conflict. Like
Right.
like proxy wars are so much different than like huge player wars. Like I don't know.
Okay.
It's just, I think it's just better to keep in mind.
What kind of an ethical framework would you use to make your argument about keeping them as a deterrent and providing checks and balances?
I guess the ethical legalism, just like I want to be able to protect myself versus somebody else.
Ethical egoism?
Personal interest.
Where we're all pursuing our own self-interest. Do you think it's possible? I think you could make that argument for sure. Do you think that I don't know, does justice is fairness? Could you argue from a justice is fairness that, but then you'd have to argue that everybody should have, if one group has weapons of mass destruction, they all should. I'm not sure that's a good idea either. So yeah, that wouldn't work. That wouldn't work. Okay. Jalen, did you have more to add when it comes to domestic terrorism?
If you're using political, religious, personal, racial, or environmental nature, as a reason to harm people, so cause people death and stuff, you have to say, you're harming people in your own country.
Yes, you're harming people within your own country. Okay. What was that about propaganda?
I said specifically when using those things for your own beliefs, not using harm people for your own beliefs. So you can really
Okay. Okay. So why would you say what is the sort of summarize the ethical issue with domestic terrorism? What does it do that's wrong? Okay, so unity, working together as opposed, okay. All right. Social contract theory. Okay. So you lose some of your protections. Okay. All right. Yeah, that actually makes sense. Anthony?
I like to think of terrorism as a way of guerrilla warfare within like citizenship. I feel like guerrilla warfare in a way is just like a way to like indirectly harm, like I don't want to say indirectly, but it's unconventional in the sense of like what war is. And I feel like that's what terrorism as well, only on, instead of like guerrilla warfare targeting combatants, terrorism is targeting non-combatant citizens. I mean, that's just like what I view of terrorism as like a definition. So like domestic terrorism,
Okay.
I feel like can be labeled under like any like citizen attack.
Okay.
I think like, but in order to cause like fear or terror, you know, to like pick apart
Sure.
society.
Sure. Braden, you had some thoughts earlier. I understand. Right. So you're saying There's no 100% guarantee that one won't go off. The threat of it destroying the world or causing significant destruction is too high, and that we should, and you would argue that we should work towards eliminating them the best that we can. Even though it probably won't happen, that's what you believe. What argument, what ethical framework would you use to make that argument? I think you can. Yeah, you would just have to be able to make the argument either way, that whatever you're arguing decreases suffering, increases happiness. That would be, that's the hard thing. I always find war and terrorism one of the most challenging ones to talk about ethical frameworks, because so often we want to use utilitarianism, but do you know how much damage and suffering war causes? I mean, I was reading in the book, the list of things goes on and on and on and on about the potential negatives about war. And if you're talking about, with utilitarianism, decreasing pain and suffering and harm and increasing happiness, and you got to measure each one, right? It's almost like you have two scales and you're like, harm and unhappy and suffering over here and happiness over here. Which one weighs the most, right? Which one is the most? And you've got to be able to argue that the happiness significantly outweighs the suffering. And I just find it, even when I want to use utilitarianism for the war, and sometimes I think it's maybe the best ethical framework, it's still really hard to argue that war, it's really hard to use utilitarianism to do that. Although I don't always know what better one to use to argue it would be. Does that make sense? Like, it just seems like a really complicated thing to argue.
I think another problem we have as Americans related to war is that we really never like experienced it in our life. Like, if we think about all the wars we fought, we fought the Civil War here, like nobody was alive. And we had some terrorist attacks like 9/11,
right?
Or whatever, but other than that, like, we never really been messed with, so it's just hard for us to relate to like the sympathetic side of war, but we never, we've seen people overseas and stuff, and you expand in English, that's terrible. I've had family that fought more and died, but just like going over there and fighting in your country and not knowing, like, waking up and walking down the road, not even having anything to avoid, might get tired just for being there, like, that's just something we can't live to. I guess maybe gun violence in the United States, I guess,
right,
maybe consider domestic terrorism, maybe, I don't know. But other than that, like, just with somebody coming over here with the intent of taking us over or winning and destroying us, we just never experienced that. I don't think, besides the Civil War.
right.
And maybe not.
I think you raise a good point that a lot of people, we've never actually experienced war, or in some cases, even the effects of war. We just hear about it and we have opinions, but we've never actually experienced it. And when it comes to domestic terrorism, we've seen the effects of that kind of stuff around. And it does heighten our anxiety in some cases for that, and makes us feel like we do need things like weapons of mass destruction to provide some type of protection or checks. I liked, was it you that said checks and balances? I like the way that sounds too. Allie?
Something I wrote my essay was a deeper background and profile checks, because the people who own, again, I'm not about the terrorism, the people who own firearms, they need to properly know how to take care of them and be mentally stable enough so that way we can reduce terrorist attacks.
Okay.
It scares me. I don't know. If I don't know if you're Republican or not, like.
So you're saying that an important piece of this would be better background checks would help maybe filter out potential terrorists if they didn't have easy access to guns potentially. Okay. Okay. What else?
Military provides like a lot of jobs for people.
Okay.
So I feel like that's pretty good for the United States. I'm currently my brother's in the Marine, so like I don't really know. I don't know a lot about like the military and stuff. I've never really been interested in it, but I know that it provides like a lot of jobs for people. So and they learn a lot of like really good skill sets. So that can help them
Sure.
whenever they're done with their service. So that's also really nice too. They also get free schooling and that's really things that come with that.
Yep. I mean, I know some people, you get 20 years in the military, you get a pension, you get lifetime insurance. And, if you went in when you're 18 and you get out when you're 38, it means that you actually, and if you got an education during that time, you could actually be a private contractor. You could go into other fields and be a professional, but, be a civilian at the same time. So there certainly can be some really good options for people. If I really am not a military person, but if I was coming out of school right now and I was looking at, going in debt like $100,000 for an education, I definitely would consider spending 20 years in the military, getting an education, and then being able to be a independent professional, from the time I was 38 on and not have to worry about insurance or a pension or anything like that. So definitely some advantages to that. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I'm just saying that
Some people like, I'll just use my brother for instance, like he never really did well in school and he was never really a school person. So, a lot of people think that the military is like just their best chance to just have some type of career. College wasn't for him, but college was for me. Is my so, some people they choose military and they go there because they really don't think that there's anywhere else for them to go. And, they get paid really well and then, they like really get paid for if they choose to go to school later on in life. So I think that, sometimes they look at it as if, okay, I'll sign a contract 4 years, no big deal, go to boot camp, do some stuff, and then I'll be done. I don't have to renew it or anything, and then I can just go on and live my life. So, I mean, because that's the way that, my brother kind of looked at it as, I don't have to be here forever if I don't want to be. I'll just do it for, however long my contract lasts, and if I want to do it, I can, and if I don't have to. So I just feel like a lot of people do it because they think that that's just kind of like their life. I believe it was 4 years. But I don't know if it comes to
well, I do think that when it comes to jobs in the military, there are some ethical issues surrounding that. And I think that you can make some arguments that there are some difficult things when it comes to military jobs. Number one, a lot of times, who's the most vulnerable to being brought into the military? What's that? Well, it would be young people, but it would also be people that don't have what? They don't have much money, right? So does that mean that politicians and people are their kids going to be going into the military where they're going to be on the front lines? So if you want to argue that military jobs would be good for people, for the most part, it's only for people that don't really have very good options financially. And So if you're arguing from a justice as fairness, where, for justice and equality, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say that military jobs are across the board bad. I'm just saying that I think it does raise some ethical red flags when the majority of the folks that come through are coming out of poverty or low income. And I don't know what the stats on that are, but I do think that it raises some red flags. Peyton?
There also are a lot of people that join the military because they want to save lives. They want to protect people. They want to help continue our freedom. It's why we want to be nurses. We want to help people. We want to save lives. It's just another way for people to be heroes. They just want to protect and help us. So, because, not personally talking, but both my brother and I have college funds. And I mean, I'm a middle class type of person. I live in a really nice neighborhood. Financially, my family is really good. My brother didn't have to go to the military if he didn't want to, but he chose to because that's the kind of person he is. He's very noble. He has a good heart, and he just wants to help people and protect people, and that's the kind of person he is. So, I see your point in your argument, but there also are a majority of people that do come from good financial stable homes and choose to go there because they think that that's just their goal and duty in life.
Okay, hold on, Allie. Let Anthony go and then you go. Okay.
Oh, I was just gonna talk about how jobs, for some military people, just like school isn't for them, but they can be very bright and they can they can apply a lot of their, I guess, education up to that point. Like one of my best friends back home, he joined the Navy. He hates school. He honestly hates school. He joined the Navy and he wants to become a nuclear physicist or whatever for them, or a nuclear engineer, and they're paying for him for that because he really loves math. But like, man, like this kid was failing like world geography. Like, you know what I mean? Like the military, I think, just gives like a great avenue for people with, I don't want to say like select skill sets, but just a way for them to apply their knowledge that they're like specifically.
I hope you're not hearing me that I say the military is only for losers. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. But just imagine a military recruiter that's sitting out in public. Who's that recruiter going to target most often? Probably not the best and the brightest that are out there, if you know what I mean. Okay, so I'm just saying that makes a real dangerous job that puts some folks that may not be I don't
I'm
know.
just saying like it's a great opportunity for them. Or I feel like it's just like an opportunity.
Well, I'm just saying that I don't know what I'm saying exactly. You can take for whatever you can take it for whatever you want. Allie, I want to hear from you.
Yeah, I just feel like hats off to anyone that joins the military, whether you have a good wife or you don't have a good wife, because you're giving yourself a second chance if you don't have a good wife or the education, and just the amount of stuff that the military can give you, like it's awesome. I'm happy, but I think it's awesome whether you are in the military for a long time or a little bit of time, just the amount of benefits that you can out of it from wherever you are.
Well, like I said, despite my reservations, if I was your age and I was coming out of school right now, I would weigh my options, and the military would be one of those options. So.
I think I one
yeah.
I mean, I consider it before like everything happened, but I wanted to do medevac units and that just and helping people. So I did go route everything. I'm still in the back of my head, probably thinking of doing the military, an opportunity I have both for the moment.
Sure. Sure. Charlie, we haven't heard much from you. What are you thinking?
I don't think war. I just don't think war should. No, okay. War is necessary. but I know it's unwarranted. And it's not in people's nature to harm others. So using the natural law theory.
Natural law theory?
Yeah. I think it's unethical,
Okay,
especially terrorism.
okay. Well said. Thank you. I think Braden had his hand up first. Yeah, natural law theory fits really well.
Well, I think murder is
Sure. Right. Well, both of you articulated that very well. Jasmine?
I would just say I think that spoke about it when I was growing up, I kind of talked about terrorism and how it's bad on the I kind of went into like and how not everyone, but some people use it and then like how it's all coming out and how the government changes regulations and stuff because of license and all that. That's how I went into I use it all, but just as a friend, and then also but yeah, I just kind of like those two like express myself.
Okay. By the way, you all have done really good at starting to apply the ethical frameworks, thinking about them, and I know some of them are hard to say, but still, we've since day one we're doing way better, right? So I'm really proud of you all. Allie.
I want to be straight up with you. I think that's what I did before too. My grandma's work building when she was still working was a 9/11 attack. So they were going to attack my grandma's building. Sometimes.
Really?
Yes, because I put it in my paper because it's an example. Of
Sure.
terrorism.
Sure.
But, basically, off the Air Force Base on almost one contact. They do communications through my grandma's building, ATV. That's where they do communications. So, Al Qaeda was going to blow up my grandma's building. So, I take terrorism very seriously because it almost finally happened.
Oh, sure. Sure.
So just keep on
Shelby, what are your thoughts? If you guys got to go, I understand some folks have other obligations, so feel free to leave the meeting. It will be, I will email out a link if you want to watch the rest of the class. Okay. I'm sorry, Shelby, go ahead.
Like in nuclear weapons, I don't know what to do with
Right. Wait a second. There's things other than war that can solve problems? What? Mm-hmm. And that would fit into, we'll get into just war theory. And part of just war theory, if you're going to justify going to war, what's one of those points? It's called a last resort, right? That we're doing exactly what you said, that before we go to war, You know, it has to be a last resort. We've exhausted all other possibilities. So that's what you're arguing? Okay. Do you have an ethical framework? What do you use in your paper? COS. Natural law theory. I think you could make an argument that using natural law, that is the most humane and would infringe on the least amount of human rights possible if we exhausted every other option before we got to war. Other thoughts or other ethical issues that you think are important when we talk about war and terrorism? Anthony?
I guess interventionism.
What is it?
Interventionism, like intervening in other countries
Oh,
on
okay.
behalf of like their wars or their civil conflict.
So international
Intervention.
international, did I spell it right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Pretty close, right? So to talk about that, what's the,
I guess, just like if the United States get involved in other countries, it's like,
what would be the moral issue if you named it?
I don't really know like what it falls under in terms of like this class, but I guess like the moral issue is just going in and dealing with, you know, like an area or a region that's not really, like has nothing to do with us. I guess, like, I don't know. People don't like, you have a problem with getting involved in conflicts that don't pertain to us. But like, they don't pertain to us.
I do think that is an important issue. And I think what we've seen a lot of times is you have political things that are in place, right? Like maybe we want oil that's there, or we want control over oil prices or whatever. I mean, that's the easiest one. I'm not a war expert, so I can't tell you what all of the political things are. You know, maybe it's control of land or whatever, but on page 83 or 381, it has a section called self-determination, and it talks about that other countries should have the right to determine what their political system is, and that a lot of times we, not just us, but other countries intervene, and then what do they want to do? They want to tell that country how they ought to run their countries, right? You know, oh, well, you have to be a democracy, or you have to put this person in place. And that 3-paragraph section on self-determination talks about how it's important for other countries to, even if there's civil unrest within their own countries, right? That even if they have civil war, it's important for them to work through that and determine what kind of a country they're going to be. And so, you know, but if we step in and we tell them, we don't allow them to experience self-determination. And I think you could use natural law theory, that's just, you know, that's unethical to do something like that. Now, what we would do is step in and say, oh, well, they can't make these things on their own. We're smarter than them, right? Which, you know, I think you could make a lot of arguments against that. But, you know, sometimes we can say, oh, they need our help. Or maybe sometimes you see all the death or the suffering that's caused by war, and we feel obligated to step in and put a stop to it. But sometimes that's not always the best thing to do. But I do think it is an ethical issue that you can make arguments for around it. Is that kind of what you were talking about with this?
Yeah, pretty.
What other issues come up?
Hatred and fear.
Hatred and fear. Talk about that.
So most terrorist attacks are fueled by a hatred for a certain group,
Mm-hmm.
and they want to instill fear into that group
Mm-hmm.
and be recognized as, well, if you think about Al-Qaeda, they want it to be recognized as a world power.
Okay.
So it's basically just trying to get the attention of one group by doing something violently hateful to it.
Mm-hmm. What's the best way to deal with that?
Depends on the situation. If it's domestic terrorism,
Yeah, what do you do in that time?
yeah, but if it's foreign terrorism, peace talks or strike back.
My understanding, Shelby and I actually talked about this, there's other things to this convention, so I were talking about like making it the thesis, and that's what we came up with, is really focusing communication between countries, because I think if we're all on the same page, like, oh, the United States is looking to Vietnam on this, and we're looking to Japan on this, and Pakistan on this, great, awesome. I think it'll help lessen the hatred and fear, honestly, I would think.
One of the challenges of this one, because I think that you're right. I think you named two things that contribute to violence and people get hurt is hatred and fear. On the other hand, sometimes I see how, and I'm only speaking about the United States because that's the country I live in. And honestly, I really don't pay a lot of attention to other countries and how they present themselves. But I see how we in America sometimes treat other countries and how we come across as better than them and how we come across as patriotic, where, oh, we're bigger than them, we're big brother, we need to show them how it's done. And I totally see how they are super pissed about Westerners. In fact, sometimes I'm very embarrassed at the type of elitism that we have and just this general sense of entitlement. And if you go to other countries, like I spent 2 weeks in Japan, it's devoid there. You don't get that kind of an attitude at all. And so I understand how other countries can look at us, especially if we're going into those other countries and we are being a military force and telling them how to live their lives and things like that. And I really do get it. And so I think that if we're ever going to address hatred and fear, number one, we can't be the ones out there creating it, and then being upset when other groups come after us. Does that mean that their domestic terrorism on us is justified? No, I don't think it is. But at the same time, I do think that hatred and fear, each country kind of also has to evaluate how they're behaving, and are they being good to the countries around them at the same time. And I don't know. I'm not going to say that the United States is bad. I'm just saying I've seen some things that I know aren't good, and I understand why we get criticized by other countries. Does that make sense, Anthony?
I think that has to do along with the indirect conflict participation you have. Because you can look at countries like South Korea. Even though I could argue that we went into South Korea and basically told them how to run their stuff and what's up. South Korea is very friendly towards the Americans. And then you look at countries like, I'm going to use Iraq as a great example. So where Iraq is indirectly fighting the United States through Saudi Arabia with their proxy war. And that's easily you know what I mean? When you think of the United States, you think of if you are an Iraqi citizen, you instantly think of this militia group got funded by the United States to hurt me directly. If that makes sense. The United States isn't directly hurting citizens.
Right,
That's like where hatred grows in small communities.
right.
That's what I think.
Lainey, I haven't heard anything from you. So what, have you had any thoughts, or have you had so many you forgot them, or what's going on there?
I think like the only thought that I have is that I talked a lot of my paper about like using the natural law theory, like explain how I thought that war and terrorism was unethical, but in some cases is necessary. So
So sometimes war and terrorism is
not
necessary,
necessary terrorism, but war is sometimes necessary.
or is sometimes necessary. Okay. That actually fits. There's a term for that. Let me find it. All right, it's called, and this is definitely on the test. It's called political realism. And political realism basically says exactly what Lainey just said, that it might not, and actually I've heard a number of you actually say similar things that would fit into political realism, where basically it's like we should avoid war if at all possible. We should work towards peace and working together. But in spite of all of our efforts, there's going to be times that war cannot be avoided. So basically it's saying we should try for this the best that we can, but even with our best efforts, sometimes war is inevitable, and that's just the way life is. You're saying why? Well, it's about our desire for control and power, that's for sure. Anthony?
I would just say allies, protecting whoever, like I'm just using like World War II, like people fought other people because they were like, it all comes down to just like alliances between countries.
Alliances,
inevitably.
right.
And like political realism, like I look at like Operation Desert Storm when the United States went into Kuwait
Mhm.
and then invaded Iran to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Like that's just because we needed to protect we wanted to protect our ally for oil because oil was in Kuwait, or
Yeah.
help fund groups
Oh,
in
yeah.
Israel because we want control over the Middle East region. We work in, it's just the same thing. Like we work with Egypt to help remove pirates from Somalia out of the Gulf of Aden because we need world trade. You know what I mean? Like it's just allies of allies. Like we work with the Somali government to remove Somalia. We work with Egypt to have that system.
Well, one thing that we never have brought up even one time about war and the morality of it, and we probably should have put this one up the very first thing, but I don't even think it's mentioned in the book. But so, and it's not on the exam, but I look forward to reading about it if you wrote about it in your essay. But okay, I want you to think about something. Number one, we're in a country where we imprison people 5 times more than any other industrialized nation, and we went from 5 private prisons to over 500, which means that the government pays contractors to build prisons, and then they pay them monthly, yearly rent so that they don't, for their prisons. Well, if you have contracts with people for prisons, what do you need? What do those contractors expect the government to do? Make sure that there's laws that keep those prisons full of people, right? If we would do that to our own people, what are we going to do when it comes to war? And I think, how many people have seen Forrest Gump? Yeah, if you haven't seen it, it's a good 4 hour, 5 hour movie. It's long, but
Right.
but what you if you've watched any of those wars about the Vietnam War, if you've watched any of those movies about the Vietnam War, why were we in Vietnam? Was it to win a war? No. Vietnam was never about winning a war. It was that the government had contracts with people that made money off of the war, right? And they needed to make those people money off of ammunition, off of airplanes, off of tanks, off of political strengths that came out of that. And if you watch any of those Vietnam wars, they'd be like, "Oh, take that hill." They take the hill, and then they're like, "Okay, drop back. Take the hill again." They take the hill and they take losses, and okay, drop back, because they didn't want to win the war. So I'm just saying that I think when it comes to war, we talk about the human aspect of it, but I'm concerned that it's not the human aspect that is actually determining the morality of war for us or other countries. I doubt that other countries are any more moral than we are. I think that's probably about a level playing field, but I'm concerned that money is determining the morality of war in most cases, if not all cases. Anthony?
That also just makes me think back to the record again, how it was called like the most privatized war in American history. And that was because of, if you guys have seen the movie War Dogs, it came out with like Jonah Hill, it's like pretty good, but it was based on a true story about how two people in, I think like Midwest America, like started a company and were basically just like picking government contracts and were fulfilling like ammunition, and they were basically just buying and selling ammunition across like the world market and then selling it to the US government to make a profit. And I feel like that's definitely like war profiteering is like the real reason for war. Like in Sierra Leone, the conflict with like blood diamonds and stuff like that was heavily influenced by just money.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
people wanted to keep the conflict going, and people wanted like more anger and more militia groups to rise up just because they could control diamond fields and then diamond mines, and then diamond mines could be sold in Europe, which would be, money. You know what I mean? I
Oh,
think that
man.
it's just money and goes around.
I can't watch very many war movies just because it breaks my heart too much. But before I realized that, I watched Blood Diamond, the movie. And if you never have, and you have a strong stomach, it's definitely worth doing, because it shows you how heartless war can be. But that one was a good movie. All right. Before I do want to get into the book, and if you go to page 373, it talks about the just war tradition. And basically, the just war tradition actually comes out of Catholicism, and Thomas Aquinas put together the beginnings of just war tradition, and he started with 3 things. Now, just war tradition are basically like for political realists that say we want to make sure that war is the we want to be able to justify that it's worth going into war over. And so Thomas Aquinas, on behalf of the Catholic Church, came up with 3 particular things. The first, Aquinas said the just war theory was that it needed to be decided by a legitimate authority, that it shouldn't be you or me. It needed to be someone that was a legitimate authority, I guess, such as a president or a king, or some person that was a legitimate authority that said this is the right thing to do. The second thing, he said that there needs to be a just cause, that force may be used only to correct a grave public evil, that is aggression or massive violence of the basic rights of whole populations. So if we're going to go to war, according to Thomas Aquinas, it needed to be a grave injustice that needed to be corrected. And the third one was right intentions, that we should avoid evil and promote good. Right intentions. Force may be used only in a truly just cause, solely for that purpose. So we talked about money. And I guess if it's for money that we're going to go to war, then we need to be able to argue that it's a just cause with right intention. So Thomas Aquinas was legitimate authority, just cause, and right intention. Those were the things that got us started. If you look at the book, I think the book actually only has a total of 5 in. Sometimes there's considered 7. I'm just going to go over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to go over all 7 of the ones that I have in my notes. It's the 3 that Thomas Aquinas said: legitimate authority, just cause, right intentions. But also, and this is called jus ad bellum. I think this is actually in, I'm pretty sure I put this in the, on the final exam. But just war theory, that's the Catholic Church, but basically just war theory was also jus ad bellum. And it takes the 3 from the just war theory that Thomas Aquinas did, and it also added comparative justice. Comparative justice says that while there may be rights and wrongs on both sides of a conflict, to override the presumption against the use of force, the injustice suffered by one party must significantly outweigh that suffered by the other party. So it's saying, if the injustice on both sides is somewhat even, it's not worth going to war over. But if the difference is substantial, it has to be substantial in order to justify going to war. Comparative justice. The next one is probability of success. That if you don't have a chance of winning, then you do not qualify as justifying going to war. That there's no moral victories when it comes to war. That if you don't have a probability of success, then you should absolutely not go. The next one is proportionality. The overall destruction expected from the use of force must be outweighed by the good to be achieved. Proportionality. Again, it's sort of like when it comes to utilitarianism, that you need to be able to weigh the pain and suffering caused with the amount of good that it's going to be. And it says if you're going to use just war theory or jus ad bellum, it says that proportionality, the amount of destruction caused should be small compared to the amount of good that is achieved. And the last one, I believe, the last one is called last resort, which we already went over, which means that force may be used only after all peaceful alternatives have been seriously tried and exhausted. And it says that these criteria, taken as a whole, must be satisfied in order to override the strong presumption against the use of force. The just war tradition seeks also to curb violence of war through restraint on armed combat between the contending parties, that by imposing the following moral standards for conduct of armed conflict. So this is jus ad bellum is justifying going to war, and jus ad bello is conduct in war. So that's conduct in war, and this is justification going to war. And jus ad bello, guide the conflict in war. And there's basically, there's just 3 of them. The first is non-combatant immunity, that if you're in war, non-combatants should not be harmed. Citizens may not be the object of direct attack, and military personnel must take due care to avoid and minimize indirect harm to civilians. The next one is proportionality. In conduct of hostilities, efforts must be made to attain military objectives with no more force than is militarily necessary, and to avoid disproportionate collateral damage to civilian life and property. So the first one is non-combatant immunity. The second one is proportionality. It's sort of like if someone stepped on your foot, you shouldn't punch them in the face and break their nose, right? Proportionality. And the third one for use ad bello is right intention, that even in the midst of conflict, the aim of political and military leaders must be peace with justice. So acts of vengeance and indiscriminate violence, whether by individuals, military units, or governments, are forbidden. So those are the three things. Those are kind of the rules that governments and people should use to be able to justify whether they should go to war or not. And those three are for use ad bello, are the guiding principles for when you're in war yourself. What do you think? Are those somewhat decent guidelines if you're going to go to war? Are they decent guidelines if you're in war? What are your thoughts on that?
Sounds good enough.
Are they a good place to start?
Should at least be tried,
What's that, Charlie?
should at least be tried, and after we try it, then we could make changes.
Okay, they should at least be tried. We can always make adjustments from there. Okay. I did want to bring up just briefly the issue of holy war. Holy wars were demonstrated most clearly during the Middle Ages. We had the Crusades. Holy war traditions argue that one may use violence in order to spread your faith. So, and it's hard to believe, but during the Crusades, Christians literally were holding Muslims at with a sword to their neck and saying, either you become a Christian or this is it. And if they didn't, that was it. It's literally violence was used. So, and I do see a lot of violence that seems to be initiated because of faith convictions, and it's a bit disturbing to me, but it still does happen. We talked about political realism. I'm going to go over briefly about some of the ethicists. Thomas Hobbes was convinced that the fear of death and the need for security were the underpinnings of civilization. Thomas Hobbes said that the fear of death and the need for security were the underpinnings of civilization, that we are naturally selfish and brutish, and we need to form civil society to keep us from being this way. In civil society, the power to use violence is transferred to the sovereign, whose power is absolute. And he says, this is probably within debate. Thomas Hobbes said that nothing short of world government with a monopoly of power will be sufficient to ensure peace. There is an Arab historian. Let's see if I can remember how to write it. Yeah. Oh. That's right. Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun is an Arab historian. And he believed that war is an inevitable part of human existence. According to the Quran, man's nature is to live in a state of harmony and peace. But peace is not the absence of war, but living within Allah's will and living according to his laws. The Prophet Muhammad taught that violence should only be used as a last resort, and the Quran does give permission to fight against wrongful aggressors. And to go along with that, you've probably heard of jihad. You may or may not have, but the term jihad is often used is defined as holy war, but it's really more like a holy struggle. And the two things that you need to know about jihad, that's Jihad, is that there is a greater jihad and a lesser jihad. And the greater jihad is an internal struggle to be the best people that we're supposed to be. And that means to follow Allah's will, sort of like, forgiveness, grace, mercy, justice, those types of things. That's the struggle. That's the greater jihad. The lesser jihad is actually external struggles and war. So the truth is that in the Muslim world, they basically have the same types of checks and balances that we do with the just war tradition. So if you're a Christian, it's not that, I don't think that a lot of Christians would not say there's no room ever for war. We would say we need to avoid it at all costs, but there may be some circumstances in which it's justified. And if you study what the Muslims teach and the Quran teaches and jihad, it's basically the same thing. It's very much in the vein of just war tradition. All right. Immanuel Kant said differences in language and religion will always divide people and provide mutual hatred and offer a pretext for war. He believed that peace needed constitutional government instead of an autocracy. So that's what Immanuel Kant had to say. Frederick Nietzsche glorified war and said a good war hallowed every cause. He despised the Christian teachings to be submissive and turn the other cheek. I think a lot of Christians despise that teaching too. I don't think in America we are very good at turning the other cheek. And I think it's a challenging thing for humans, period. But Frederick Nietzsche came out and said that he didn't like that teaching, that we should be submissive and turn the other cheek. When we get to utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill provided the philosophical background for the peace movement of the 19th century, arguing that war is immoral because it diminishes happiness and causes pain and suffering. Because of this, another means must be used to resolve international conflict. If you read the book, we have a lot of war, and we've had a lot of war over a long period of time, and it's caused a lot of damage. When it comes to John, we talked about Jonathan Granoff, and he has an essay called Peace and Security, in which he really emphasizes the golden rule. If you don't know the golden rule, it's do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And he said that reciprocity matters. Let's see here. Ron Paul is a politician that wrote and he actually, I think he's in this version of the book too, right? He is? Okay. He brings up the issue of conscription. If you've never heard of conscription, have you ever heard of the draft? When my dad was 18, he got drafted to go to Vietnam War. And so he had no choice. He literally had to either show up and be assigned, or he could go enlist. So he went and enlisted in the Navy. Ron Paul has a really good essay about conscription, in which he basically argues that conscription and the draft make it possible for countries to fight very unpopular wars. And if you look at the war in Vietnam, that's a good example. Like, we probably wouldn't have fought that war for as long as we had if we couldn't draft people, right? And I believe that's the last war that we've used conscription and forced people to be in. But he argues against conscription, against the draft, based on the grounds that most wars cause senseless suffering and that conscription of young people is discriminatory and constitutes forced servitude with the risk of death and serious injury as a price to live free. And that makes no sense. He says that all drafts are unfair because they hit the most vulnerable young people. And as elites, elite people that have resources quickly learn how to avoid the risks of combat. So do you think that when the draft comes, do you think that a senator's children are going to get drafted and sent to the front lines? No, they're not going to. They're not going to. So you could argue from a justice as fairness standpoint that conscription and the draft is a very, very unfair policy. He said that without conscription, unpopular wars are much harder to fight and the end can never justify the means. And I don't know how to compare the war that George Bush got us into in the Middle East with the Vietnam War, but we certainly haven't had a war like Vietnam that was as egregious against our own people as that was. So you can make your own arguments about the war that we've been in that seems to have no end, but I think that Ron Paul's argument that conscription and the draft do make it possible for us to fight very unpopular wars that most people would say that we don't have any business being in. All right. Any comments or questions about anything? Let's see. The book also had some good points about the moral issues starting on page 379. It talks about respect for persons. It talks about human rights and the challenges, the moral issues around that. It talks about consequentialism and non-malfeasance, which is the duty to do no harm. It also talks about the principle of double effect. That's probably, I'd read that section. It's probably on the final exam. The principle of double effect was actually used to justify the bombing of the civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was like, well, the primary intention was to end the war. The unintended consequence was a whole bunch of civilians died, so that would be the principle of double effect. The book says one of the problems with this principle is that unintentional harms are still harms. Killing civilians unintentionally with another end in mind does not justify knowingly killing them, especially if the unintended harms of the action outweigh the intended benefits. The principle of double effect also reduces people being unintentionally harmed as a means only, and thus violates Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. It has a nice section on justice. Ronald Reagan opposed the military draft, arguing that an all-voluntary military is more motivated and effective. I thought that was interesting. It also talks about the duty of fidelity to your own country and personal responsibility. So there's some good things in there as well. Any comments or questions? Any stuff that we've missed? Any ethical issues that we missed? Yeah. I really appreciated the things that you brought up. I appreciate the discussion that we had. Actually, I really appreciate it for the whole semester. I thought we had a great semester. So, no questions about anything at this point? All right. Well, don't tell them I let you out an hour and a half early, but there you go. Lainey, thank you for joining us. You have a great evening.